Ranina ranina, also known as the king crab, red frog crab or wrench crab, is a species of crab found throughout tropical and subtropical habitats. It is commonly harvested for its meat and is the only known species in its genus. It can grow up to 15.0 centimeters, 5.9 in, long and can weigh up to 900 grams, 2.0 pounds. The carapace is wider at the front, reddish-brown, with 10 white spots. Ranina ranina is mainly nocturnal and hides in the sand during the day. Ranina ranina is easily distinguished from other crabs in its habitat by its red carapace and long midsection. The wrench crab lives in coastal waters along the east coast of Australia, from Yeppoon in Queensland to the north coast of New South Wales. There is also a population north of Perth in Western Australia. Ranina ranina is abundant in coastal waters southwest of Mindanao, Philippines. These crabs are also found off the east coast of Africa, across the Indian Ocean to Indonesia, Japan, Hawaii and Vietnam. Ranina ranina lives at depths of 10 to 100 meters, 33 to 328 feet, on fine sandy substrates, burying themselves from which they attack small bottom-dwelling fish. When waiting for prey, Ranina ranina will cover themselves with sand, but leave their eyes and mouth exposed to aid in detecting food. Offshore areas within this range in subtropical or tropical environments are habitat for Ranina ranina, but they must have enough sand for Ranina ranina to thrive, as covering themselves with sand is instrumental in their method of catching prey. Ranina ranina crabs are a popular species of crab fished. In Australia, 96% of females are not caught. In one location during the breeding season, the decline in the number of hunted females did not apply. This means that the particular area of Talos Beach is the focus of the spawning migration. The species is commercially exploited throughout most of its range, but the largest fishery is in Australia, where the annual commercial catch is estimated at 3,592 tons, 7,919,000 pounds. In Queensland, only adults with a carapace length of over 100 mm, 3.9 in, are landed. In the Philippines in 2008, the price of Ranina ranina was around 200 to 300 pesos per kilogram. Ranina ranina populations have been surveyed to avoid overfishing and are currently stable. Although Ranina ranina is a target of commercial fishing activities, little is known about the biology, population dynamics and ecology of the species. Attempts have been made to raise Ranina ranina in captivity, but to date have had little success. Ranina ranina is a local specialty in some parts of the Philippines, where it is known as karacha. It is often steamed as halibos, or cooked in coconut milk as ginatan. A notable variation of the latter is the alavar karacha of Zamboanga City. In Vietnam, the species is known as hind de crab, literally meaning king crab. This name refers to the fact that aranina was a delicacy historically favored by Vietnamese kings. It is a delicacy harvested in the provinces of Binh Dinh and Quang Ngai, and is hailed as the king of all crabs. Several species of crabs can be found in both saltwater and freshwater areas throughout the United States. Some of the most popular saltwater crabs to catch are king crab and snow crab, common in Alaska, Dungeness crab on the west coast, and Atlantic blue crab, also known as Chesapeake blue crab. Saltwater crabs tend to prefer shallow, marshy waters, so consider destinations like brackish rivers, bays, and estuaries. And while you can catch crabs by boat, the great thing about crabbing is that you can be just as successful on land. Crabs like to stay near structures, so when planning your trip, look for locations like piers, and jetties. Freshwater crabs like fiddler crab and red crab are best caught in shallow waters close to land. Common places you'll find these species are along shorelines with hiding places, such as wooded beaches, boulders, or grass. Stony reefs are another popular habitat. What makes crabbing a great activity for beginners is that you don't need much special equipment. The simplest way to catch crabs is with a dip net. Another easy method is to drop a line with bait on the end. Just wait for a crab to pull in, then pull the crab in, catching it with the net. The only downside to the line method is that you can only catch one crab at a time. To catch more crabs, you can use crab traps. Crab traps are wire cages attached to a long rope that is lowered to the bottom of a body of water. Depending on your preference and budget, there are many different types that can be used effectively, including crab rings, pyramid traps, standard squares, and more. With any of these, you'll secure the bait inside with a rope, line, or clip, which will attract the crabs into the trap. Once you've set the trap, you just sit back and wait. A good rule of thumb is to check your trap every 15 to 30 minutes. When you pull up your trap, you'll need a net or bucket to hold the crabs and keep them from running away. You may also want a pair of crabbing gloves to avoid getting pinched. Crabs are scavengers, which means you're more likely to use bait when crabbing. While there are many types, fresh bait is usually best, and the smellier the better, as crabs will gravitate towards strong-smelling options. Some good options include raw chicken or turkey, dead fish, and razor clams. You can even use sausage spanner crab. I have to say that this is my favorite crab to eat with its beautiful sweet tender white meat, and the ease of catching a tasty meal with minimal effort puts spanner crabs at the top of my list. Don't get me wrong, I also enjoy mud crabs or sand crabs, but let me explain why spanner crabs are my favorite of all our local crabs. Most recreational anglers don't target them, as most of us find them too difficult to catch in our baskets. I certainly did in my years of fishing, and didn't realize that on most of our offshore fishing trips we were running into prime spanner crab territory. I've talked about maybe giving them a try for a long time, but it didn't happen until about 15 years ago. I pulled the trigger and invested in some spanner crab catching equipment and have never looked back since. It was a great investment. A few things to know about spanner crabs, also known as frog crabs. First, the best time of year to target them is in the cooler months of April to October. However, they can be caught all year round along the east coast of Queensland, northern NSW and parts of WA. There is an annual closure in Queensland, and at the time of writing this article, the closure is from the 1st of November to the 15th of December. The minimum size limit for spanner crabs is 10 centimeters from the center of the spine to the base of the carapace, head to base of the tail, with a possession limit of 20 per person. Females are not allowed. They live up to 15 years, they are a long crab. The interesting thing is that they walk back and forth, not sideways like other crabs, and they are red, so they look like they have been cooked. Often at the marina, people ask us if we cook them on board. They lie buried in the sand waiting for food and live at depths of 10 meters to 100 meters or more. To get started and set up, you will need a few things. First, pots or dillies. Without being technical, I call them pots, which may not be the correct term, but for the sake of argument, they are flat square nets 1 meter by 1 meter. These are not available in all fishing shops, but there are some crabbing specialists who will help you. You will find them online, no pun intended. Second, you will need rope, and lots of rope. Most of my spanner crabbing is done in 50 to 60 meters depths, so I usually run 80 to 100 meters of rope per pot to account for the current. Don't let your rope be too short. If the pots drift into deeper water, you will lose them. And thirdly, some buoys. Make sure you invest in larger ones, as standard 150mm round buoys can easily become invisible and difficult to locate, especially if there is a bit of swell or swell on the water. In Queensland you are allowed 4 pots per person. In 15 years of spanner crabbing I have never deployed more than 4 pots, regardless of the number of crew on board. There is simply no need. Now you are all set up and have all the gear, it's just a matter of finding the crabs. But where do you start? There's plenty of ocean out there with a sandy seabed, right? The good news is, they're not too hard to find, and if you fish offshore regularly, like me, you've driven past some great spanner crab beds to get to your favorite fishing spots. I tend to look for sand and changes in water depth, so a clear drop-off is a good place to start. Most newer GPS units have good accurate contour lines, shaded depth changes and sandy areas noted on the chart, so you can mark some areas worth investigating the day before your trip. One important thing to mention is that all of my spanner crabbing is done on the return trip from a fishing session, so crabs are always an added bonus to a great fishing trip. There's absolutely no need to leave jars on the way to your fishing session for hours at a time and risk losing them to the current or other boats potentially running over them. So once you have chosen an area, bait the jars, in between jars as you would sand crabs or mud crabs. Bait them with good quality bait like fresh mullet or fish frames from a recent trip and deploy the jars. Spacing the jars about 500 meters apart will give you good coverage time to soak. If you have placed your pots in an area with plenty of food, it won't take long for the wrench crabs to find the bait as they are aggressive feeders, especially after molting. About 45 minutes to an hour is plenty, any longer won't make a difference whether or not the crabs are in the area. As the saying goes, there's no point beating a dead horse. Now comes the painful but somehow satisfying part of collecting the pots and pulling 100 meters of rope in anticipation of some crabs. Your arms will feel hot, especially if you have a pot full of crabs. If you are successful in choosing the right area, a soak with 4 pots can usually yield 30 to 40 decent-sized crabs. On the other hand, if you are lucky, it only takes a kilometer or 2 to find crabs in most cases. A little tip, if you are in the right area, you will see grains of sand in the net bag of bait. Once you have identified a productive area, mark this area for future crabbing. Remember that these crabs are always on the move, so it may be necessary to move a few hundred meters to a kilometer or more from previous successful trips, but generally they are never too far away. When releasing small crabs, handle them with care. Removing them from the pot can be a very tedious exercise and will certainly test your patience, but breaking the limbs of these crabs significantly increases their mortality. Scientific studies have shown that mortality increases by up to 85% if the limbs are broken, so ensuring they return unharmed will give them a better chance of survival. Hopefully you have a delicious crab meal on board, but now what to do with them? I usually cool or ice them enough to keep them asleep, but don't overdo it, as you don't want them to get too cold. You want the boiling water to still be boiling after you put the crabs in the pot. A pressure cooker is also a good investment if you do it regularly and makes the process easier and the cooking time more accurate. The trickiest part with spanner crabs is the cooking time. They are already red, so unfortunately you can't use the color change as they cook as an indicator. However, with that said, you will see the red color become much more vibrant and flavorful. However, this alone is not enough to determine whether they are overcooked or not. Through years of experimentation and learning, I can tell you that 12 minutes for 10 crabs in the pot is ideal, or when you see the shell on the tail of the crab start to lift and separate from the rest of the body. There is also a long-standing debate about whether or not to add salt to the cooking water. I usually don't add salt to the cooking water. Salted water has a higher boiling point and lowers the specific heat of the water. Crabs have enough salt in them, and I find that just fresh water doesn't affect the saltiness of the crabs. However, for the ice mix, I recommend adding a little salt. Not adding salt during the cooling process will definitely wash out some of the saltiness in the meat. Keep the ice mix time to a minimum. Once they're cool and the cooking has stopped, remove them from the ice mix. Another tip, use a high ratio of ice to water for the ice mix. Crabs are white. Almost all crabs are full of meat. They're firm and sweet. If you cook them right, the meat will separate from the hard shell and cartilage without much effort. If you've never